Okay, well, Happy New Year and welcome to the January 4th Capital Finance Community Task Force meeting. My name is Cynthia Cross, your committee chair, and I want to thank our vice chair, Jamie Finch, for chairing the meeting last month in my absence. This evening, we don't have a lot of new material, but we do want to get through a series of dense discussion questions. The task force has demonstrated a good ability to tackle hard stuff efficiently, so I have no doubt we'll get there this evening. Tonight, we'll prioritize getting through all the questions rather than fully exhausting each one before we move on, just because they're so interrelated. On the other hand, as we're moving towards the final stages of this process, please be assertive and make your case as appropriate, even if we're trying to move along. As I mentioned, she already mentioned, Parker won't be joining us. Andrea, no other absences that you're aware of?
That's correct. No other absences that I'm aware of.
Okay, that's all I have. So that brings us to the minutes. I'm seeking approval of minutes by unanimous consent as presented.
I have one suggestion.
Go.
Minutes.
Go for it.
Okay, on item C is in CAT, where we say discuss revenue tools. The first major sentence says the task force by consensus agreed that the city should identify and leverage additional revenue sources. My recollection was that we, by consensus, agreed that the city should identify and consider leveraging additional revenue sources. I don't know what others recollect, but I think the decision to consider was absolutely, but the decision that we must leverage additional resources, I don't think that we were quite to that point yet. So my suggested wording is identify and consider leveraging additional revenue sources.
Okay, we still consider approval of minutes with those changes by unanimous consent as modified? I think that hand wave by Tim was a consent, not an objection. Is that correct? Right. Okay. So hearing no objection, the minutes are approved with that modification.
Thank you.
And now let's go back over to here. It sounds like we are to public comment. Do we have any public comment, Andrea?
I don't believe that we do. But I think there is a phone number here that I see is dialed in. I'm not sure. I know our CFO, Robert, is also dialed in. I'm wondering if there's another person on the line. Juliana, can you help identify who this person might be? I don't know if they have permission to speak.
I will unmute the number ending in 14. It only shows us the last two numbers. So you're unmuted if you could identify yourself. I wonder if it might be Robert because he called in on two numbers.
So it sounds like we should move on. If we're incorrect, please let us know. But we're going to go ahead and move on because we are not seeing any obvious public comment. And that brings us to item 4, where I will turn it over to Mr. Paul, I believe. Unless, Andrea, did you have some opening remarks as well?
I do just quickly have some opening remarks to make before I turn it over. So first of all, good evening and Happy New Year. With me today to help present is Gene Paul, our management analyst. He'll be up next. And our Chief Financial Officer, Robert Hamoud, who is joining us from Brazil. So he may have some connection issues as we move forward. So if there's any connection issues, just please have patience. And so grateful that Robert is joining us from his vacation. And the other heads up I wanted to give this evening was that I got my booster yesterday, and so if I'm a little off, then I've asked Jean, and certainly I invite each of you, if I'm not making sense in what I'm saying, please step in and ask clarifying questions, and also give me a little bit of grace, because for those of you who've been through it, I think you know it's you're not at your best in the 24 hours after the booster generally. So just had to admit that I might be a little off this evening. So with that said, you know, the first, if we could go to the next slide, please. So today, we are going to spend some time following up and providing additional information that you requested from last time. And so that's, Jean's going to be providing some of that information, and Robert as well. We will review the discussion that we had from the last meeting, where we really started to have a substantive conversation about our potential financial revenue tools that the city should explore. There were a few things that were put out on the table for consideration of the task force. I'd like to finish up that conversation tonight, discuss those potential revenue tools, and provide recommendations on timing as well for when you think that the city should employ those tools. So that's it for tonight. We'll be, I think, talking a little bit later about the rest of the process. We are coming into the beginning of the year. It was designed for this task force to really finish up the recommendations in January and February. So that's really where we're pointed. And, you know, I really see that we only have, after this meeting, 2 meetings left. And so we want to make the most of the discussions that we have to get to a good point on your recommendations. And so that's a little bit of a preview of what's to come ahead. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Jean.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. I'm Gene Paul, the management analyst from the mayor's office. And as Andrea indicated, I'll be providing some follow-up information from some of the questions over the last meetings. So the first question, I believe, came from Jason at the last meeting, was, as the city considers adjusting the SEPA threshold for projects, do we know if this would have a negligible or a broad impact on the collection of mitigation fees? And based on information from Director Minnie Dhaliwal, our Community Planning and Development Director, the answer is it'd be a relatively small reduction. Currently, the city has the lowest possible threshold for triggering a SEPA review. So essentially, very small projects would get a review in Issaquah, which may not get a review in a different city. The state revised those thresholds after we set ours, and it allows up to 30 single-family resident units or 30,000 square foot of commercial development for a project before technically the state would require a SEPA review. Our Planning Policy Commission looked at the current thresholds and was only considering raising the threshold to 10 single-family units or 10,000 square foot of commercial development as an incentive for sustainable development. But to my knowledge, no action has been taken on that. It was just a consideration. And in the last 5 years, 20 residential and 5 commercial SEPA applications have been submitted. And if we had raised those thresholds, only a couple of those projects would not have received a SEPA review. So while it's hard to quantify, just because the value of each project can change, it would be a relatively small reduction in those mitigation fees. The next question was in regards to how much general fund funding goes to Parks capital projects. And I pulled some information from the budget from the last 5 years. You can see the top row is general fund support. The second row is overall capital funding for Parks projects, and then just kind of the percentage for each year. And as you can see, some pretty broad variety. Obviously, 2022, there's no general fund support, and in 2020, there was a peak of 37% of the Parks capital funding coming from the general fund. Overall, there's a mix. Some of it is direct transfers from the general fund. There's also been an accumulating transfer over time for turf replacement, where essentially the city has set aside about $200,000 a year. And in 2021, it took $600,000 from that pot of money and used it for a project. And then there's also some general fund debt capacity that's been set aside for acquiring either sensitive land or hillside acquisitions. So as you can see on the far right there, an average, roughly a little over $500,000 for each budget year, and about 20% of any given budget year has been general fund support. And I'll pause there because I see there's a question.
Stacey, you have a question? Oh.
I do, thanks. Dean, do you know for total parks in 2019 and 20, for the parks, why we have those highs there? You know what they're for?
In terms of what projects were actually on the list for those years?
Yeah, and I was just thinking about the Cougar Mountain money that we put in, I was just thinking about that project, so I was wondering if you had more information on that.
So for 2020, there was $500,000 set aside for land acquisition, just under $500,000 set aside for hillside acquisition, and then $200,000 for Central Park Pad 3. So kind of a mix. There's also, I think, going to be different funds if you're talking about the Bergsma acquisition specifically. That's kind of there was probably some general fund support. I didn't exactly pull the project funding for that one specifically, but I can if you're interested.
Okay, that's okay. I was just curious if you know off the top of your head. Thanks.
Okay, so the next kind of question after the Parks General Fund support was recent sales tax ballot measures and whether they have been successful or not. So there have been 9 in either King County specifically or cities from King County. And of those in the last 7 years, 7 of the 9 have passed or been successfully voted forward. Starting from the top of the list, you can see North Bend had a public safety sales tax measure that passed in 2014. King County had a failed measure in 2017 that would have been able to support cultural education in schools. And in 2018, Covington voters denied a 0.2% TBD sales tax, which they also disapproved in 2013 and 2015. So there's kind of a history of Covington voters not supporting a TBD sales tax. In 2018, there were also 2 other successful sales taxes. One was a 0.1% public safety in Kirkland that would support police officers, school resource officers, and other human services. And in Shoreline, there was a successful 0.2% TBD sales tax that was devoted mostly to sidewalk maintenance and sidewalk infrastructure. In 2019, the city of Duval passed a 0.2% TBD sales tax. The following year, Seattle passed a 0.15% sales tax, and that was a replacement of a 0.1% and a $60 vehicle license fee or car tab that had passed in 2014. And that measure that passed in 2020 was devoted towards transit and repairs for the West Seattle Bridge. And then in the most recent general election in 2021, both Snoqualmie and North Bend passed 0.2% TBD sales taxes. In Snoqualmie, it replaced a $40 car tab, and in North Bend, it renewed a 2011 measure. So that concludes kind of the follow-up information, and I think I'll turn it back over to Andrea.
Andrew, you see there's a question from Kathy? Go ahead.
Thank you. So my question is looking at these and what passed, can you tell me, since especially the ones in 2021 and the Seattle one in 2020, which had a slight increase, but all of those were renewals, what is the highest percentage of sales tax that is charged in any of our neighboring cities?
I don't have that information off the top of my head, so I'd have to follow up with you on that one.
Okay, because my recollection is that right now Issaquah is the highest sales tax percentage on the east side. But again, with these recent changes, considering the renewals or reshuffling, I think it's important to note not just who has passed, but what everybody else's total sales tax collected is versus ours. Just between the last meeting and this one, I've reached out to several businesses, including Costco, and some of our large ticket item retailers who are extremely concerned about conversations around sales tax. I didn't have an answer either, so I'm just looking to city staff to provide more insight. That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Great question, and we can certainly get that information. So moving forward, let's talk a little bit about the process that we've already begun and where we see this recommendations process going. As I said at the top of the meeting, we anticipate 2 more meetings in addition to this one to really form those recommendations. Last time we looked at that draft outline of what that recommendations report could look like. We'll revisit that at the next meeting. And then, as we talked about, this evening we'll be discussing and recommending new revenue tool options and assigning timelines. That's for tonight. And then we have some other questions that we still need to answer as part of these recommendations. We need to go back and revisit those priorities for the buckets or the categories of infrastructure within our capital improvement plan. We had, you had prioritized transportation as number 1, the thing we should do first. Given the financial tools and the discussion tonight, does that still make sense? We talked about this priorities process being iterative. And then we need to go back and revisit parks and trails and facilities. Those had not yet been prioritized by the task force. They were kind of neck and neck in our scoring with the criteria. And so would like to revisit that and see how some of the consideration of the financial tools may affect the priorities in terms of what you recommend the city tries to tackle first, second, third, etc. Then we also, we had talked about ARPA a few months ago. I want to bring that back and see if the task force has any recommendations for how to use ARPA funds towards infrastructure projects and some of our unfunded needs. And as well as the ending fund balance. We talked about that. The city has some considerations, and you may have some recommendations for how we use that ending fund balance to support infrastructure and funding our infrastructure needs. So those are all questions we still have to answer for next time. I just wanted you to know that we're keeping track of these things, and we'll be going through continuing this kind of question and answer discussion with our next meeting to cover some of those topics. Next slide, please. One of the things as Cynthia and Jamie and I were talking about how to structure these meetings and how to come to some of the recommendations and discussions was just revisiting some of the points that this task force has made over the past few months regarding criteria or other considerations that you would be using that you said were important to consider regarding infrastructure and how we fund it. So I just wanted to revisit those in case that was helpful and useful for the conversation today. We didn't come up with a separate list of criteria for the funding tools that you wanted to recommend. It seems like there might be some overlap. So I just wanted to revisit some of the things that I've heard this task force say in the past that were important considerations for you as you make these recommendations. One of those things that I heard frequently from this group is that you want to make sure that how we address infrastructure in the city, that it addresses the pain point across the city, and that there's a large impact in the community. These first few are criteria that you had come up with, that there would be a big return investment. And in fact, I think it was mentioned again last time that we don't want to ask for funding for just design of a project. We want to make sure that there's a big return on that and that it has that, again, that impact. Third, that revisiting our conversations on the community survey, that how we move forward, our priorities that we move forward with, really address what was identified in the community survey by our residents as low satisfaction and high priority items. And also what was important to you was considerations of life safety. How are we going to prioritize that? And I heard the desire to be ambitious and visionary in what you recommend and what the city's next step should be regarding infrastructure, that we also consider equity and financial impacts to Issaquah households. We've heard that one a lot. We have more information on financial impacts to Issaquah households in tonight's packet and that revenue options table document that's in the packet. And there may be a slide or two that Robert presents as well. And then what would have public support? This was brought up very early in our conversations, wanting to make sure that we don't lose sight of that lens while you're making recommendations and diving into the details and really thinking about what do you think that the community would really get behind. So all of these things just sum up some of the considerations and values that I've heard this task force bring up multiple times during the course of our discussion. And I just wanted to revisit those in case that was helpful for your discussion today as you recommend financial tools. Next slide, please. Okay, and I think this is where I turn it back over. So Robert, are you available? I think he's dialed in multiple formats, so we'll just need to make sure that he's unmuted on whatever device is going to work. And Juliana, can you confirm that he is unmuted from your end?
He is unmuted as far as I can see.
Okay. Okay. I know he's with us, as he said that he could see the screen and he could see the presentation. I think it's audio issues that he's probably frantically trying to troubleshoot.
Can you?
Yes, we can hear you, Robert.
Okay, let me try this. Okay, apologize to everybody for this connection. I definitely wanted to participate in this meeting to get you this information so it could help you make your decisions. And I know we're kind of on a time crunch with this. So with the Transportation Benefit District, and I do want to address one of the questions that just came up regarding how much sales tax that the average resident here in the city of Issaquah does pay. So when you talk about a transportation benefit district, it's a 0.2% sales tax. So it's, if you look at it this way, it's 0.2% out of the 10.1% total that an average resident would pay, or a business would pay for goods and services within the city of Issaquah right now. So again, the city only receives at this point 0.86% of that 10.1%. So if it's 10.1 cents, the city doesn't even receive 1 cent of that 10.1 cents back, if you look at it that way. So this is where local governments are limited in the state of Washington and what we collect. And even in the total quote unquote 1% local tax that the city receives by statute, the county actually receives 0.15 of that right off the top. So this is where we're limited. So this is one of the tools in the toolbox to raise revenue. Now, I wanted to try to break it down as, what the impact would be to a resident with this. So here's what I did. And again, this is not an exact science. It's very hard because we don't have, the actual data of the shoppers going into a store. But what I did was I looked at the annual, the annual sales tax that the city of Issaquah brings in. And I looked at how much what categories would residents actually spend tax on? And so residents, there's certain sales tax categories that follows the national standards for business codes. And so it's broken down into categories such as goods and services, gym memberships, general retail, online sales is part of that general retail. Then it has like warehousing, transportation, business to business. That's where, let's say, Costco would buy equipment for their new headquarters, and construction. So I was just looking at the categories that the average person would spend money on day to day. And what I came up with was, if you looked at the 40,000 or odd population that came out of the census for the city of Issaquah, and you looked at what the sales tax base would be if I just took out that information. So if I took out all the major categories and just looked at everyday spending, like I said, looked at what's going on in Fred Meyer, what's going on in Safeway, what's going on at Target, what are people spending day to day as residents, not businesses within the city. But then I also looked at the other factor here. It's what is the impact to a resident? Because Issaquah is a magnet. More people come into the city to shop. It is a higher daytime population. And for example, I lived in Snoqualmie for 3 years. I did all my shopping in Issaquah. So when you look at North Bend, you look at Sammamish, you look at other cities that are underserved with retail, they're coming into the city of Issaquah to shop. So I did a guess, and my guess is my estimate, and this is, I'm going to be honest, I think a conservative estimate, is about 40% of what I'm factoring in, 40% of the sales tax generated from businesses, from everything in the city, is about 40% out of the city. And again, that's probably a conservative number just based on the nature of Issaquah as being a hub for commercial activity and retail activity. And so when I looked at that average impact on residential sales tax, I said about $22 annual increase per resident on general consumer purchases. So again, I'm just looking at categories like if you're going to Target, you're going to Safeway, and remember, if you go to the grocery store, not everything's taxable. So your flour is not taxable, but your cleaning supplies would be taxable. Those kinds of things. Grocery, food is not. More tangible goods are not. So not everything in the stores are taxable. Then I'm looking at what people are purchasing, and I'm not counting auto sales because people aren't buying a car every year. So I'm just looking at those everyday items. And if I look at that, it's about a $22 annual increase per resident on those consumer purchases. And then also the sales tax base of Issaquah. Yes.
Robert, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We do have a lot of material to get through today. I really appreciate your diligence in your methodology and explaining that to us. I'm wondering if there's a way we can kind of just sum up and get to really your conclusions for how much you think that impact would be. And maybe that's where you were headed, and I just cut you off for that. But I know that we have a lot to discuss tonight.
Okay, sorry about that. So again, it's going to generate $3.7 million of annual revenue. If anybody wanted to contact me, I think Andrea can get you in touch with me. I can give you more of that background data if you'd like it. But again, it's about 3.7 million in annual revenue would generate on average for that TBD. And again, that impact to residents would be about $22 per resident if I'm just looking at what the impact would be to an average resident. And you can go to the next slide, please. And just a side note, the sales tax usually grows every year. So we're looking at a 5% increase each year, normally with sales tax as a minimum. With the TBD, so going to the transportation car tab, if you're just looking again, instead of a sales tax, you're looking at a car tab, it would generate approximately $506,000 annually at the $20 fee, $1.1 million at the $40 fee. That's about 12% of what the Sound Transit excise tax is in the city if you're looking at an average car value of $23,000. So again, it's smaller than what other agencies do collect already within the city on when you pay your car tabs. But the fee would only apply to residents and businesses. It's not going to capture those out of town people coming in and spending money.
Robert,
and next slide.
Sorry, there's a couple questions, and I wasn't sure what the nature of the questions are as appropriate. So if Mr. Voice and Mr. Flood, if your questions are about the first two slides, please go ahead, starting with Mr. Voice, and if not, we'll hang on to them.
My first one should be pretty straightforward. Sorry, Jason, step on you. What percentage tax increase does that 3.7 reflect? Is that 0.1%, 0.2% tax rate increase?
It's the 0.2%. That's the maximum allowed for the TBD if you were to go to voters for voter approval.
So
Yes.
it would have to go to voter approval, and it would end up with 10.3% in city limits.
That is correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Voice?
Great. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Mahmoud, from joining us from Brazil. Real quickly, so that first slide, the one right before this one, it says applies to residents, but to out-of-city residents and out-of-city businesses. I guess that's the point of my clarification. Tax applies not only to residents, but to out-of-city residents and businesses. My question is, does this also affect city business purchases? My concern is that because Issaquah is such a service-oriented economy, we really only have a couple behemoths here, Costco, the car dealerships, but really some of our small businesses, we're talking about very small businesses. I'd hate to see a regressive tax on those smaller entrepreneurs in the city. I'd like to see things incentivized to have people build their businesses in Issaquah. So am I reading that right? It's only out-of-city businesses that make purchases in Issaquah?
No, I'm sorry. It was not only to residents, but also anybody. It would be to businesses and residents within the city. I was just trying to add the fact that businesses that come from out of the city, but they do deliveries within the city, they're taxed. If they sell anything within the city limits, they're taxed. Yes, it is city businesses, but it's also anybody doing business in Issaquah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Carry on. Thank you. Robert, I can't hear you. Can anyone else hear Robert?
No, I wasn't talking.
Oh,
I
I'm
was
sorry.
waiting for it.
I meant Robert.
It's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for answering those questions. Go ahead and carry on.
Yes. And want to thank Gene for helping me with these slides going. And I know he's been working on property tax for the city for several years now. So with a levy lid lift, this becomes really complicated. So I'm just going to give you the highest level view. And again, please contact us directly if you have any follow-up questions. This is the breakdown of a house for $822,000. Hopefully everybody got the handout because it's very tiny. Doesn't always correlate with the mill. There's a lot of differences with property tax. So just for these purposes, this is just a breakdown of the bill, breakdown of the different taxing districts and jurisdictions that comprise the bill. And you see that this average tax bill for about $822,000, about the median assessed values, $7,900 a year. Issaquah taxes are less than 10% of that average tax bill. Next slide. And I just tried to break this down. I won't spend too much time on this. There is a local maximum and a state maximum. The state, right now, the capacity of the city of Issaquah is about $2.52 per 1,000 that can be raised for a voter-approved levy lid lift. And just the semantics, I think, just for the education of the group here, there's two different. The general levies, again, would just go into the city's general levy. It wouldn't be for specific bonding. That would go against this maximum lid lift. If you decided to go to voters for a specific bond, like the city's done in the past, for a set period of time, that would not go against the limit. So there would not be a limit on that. However, it's a higher threshold for voter passage. And there's some other intricacies about passing that. So that's further information. If the task force or the council went to that direction, we would provide that information later on the details.
Got a question from Jamie.
I think that, yes.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Thanks, Robert. Is it safe to say then, I'm seeing city general levy and city bond levy. I'm trying to get a sense of what's I know on the previous slide you showed percentage of the overall, but in this, when we're looking at it this way, is it kind of that 0.81 plus 0.14 of what the city is actually taking today out of the 1,000 AV, or is it Is that incorrect or?
Right, so the 0.4 per $1,000 of assessed value, yes. It's the 0.81 from the general levy plus the 0.14 from the bond levy.
Thank you.
No more questions at this time, Robert. Go ahead. Thanks.
Okay. Next slide. And so again, the maximum levy rate, as we said, was 3.31 per 1,000 of assessed value. And I said there's a local cap. Again, that was due to the voter initiative generated by Tim Eyman several years ago now. City general rates about 0.81 for 1,000. The city has, again, that remaining capacity. And so next slide, please. And so the revenue potential, just to break it down this way, if you look at the property tax levy for 2021 was about $9.8 million. The tax impact, and again, there's some differences within the community. I won't really go into this right now, but the average tax impact for an $825,000 median property is about $645. So again, of that tax bill that I showed, about $645 is going to the city. So if you're looking at levy lid lift, $5 per 1,000 AV assessed value. So if I just did an extra 0.5, so 0.81 plus 0.5, the 0.5 itself would generate about $6 million, and it would add 413 to that average tax bill, that $825 tax bill. If I went 1, that's obviously $1 would be over that 0.81 per 1,000 AV. That generated about $12 million to the city. That'd be an additional $825 on top of that 645. That didn't, and none of these values account for any new construction or newly assessed values in future years within the city. Next slide. The other thing that I wanted some information was red light camera. And what's funny is in Brazil, there's literally red light cameras every single street in the city I'm in, which is about 5 people. So it's very common, at least down here, but a little less common in Washington. There's a couple cities that have used it now for several years, Gallup and the city of Moses Lake. So I was looking at information from this. One high intersection with red light cameras, we've been approximately about 310,000 per red light. And I put about 20% in administrative fees. I apologize, I didn't have the background details of paying on the school, just because I went to the city, I live on the schools. I think there's a little bit more administration with the larger stuff. But I estimated the city's about 2,500 annual violations per intersection. Is $124 per light. So that's about $310,000 annually per one intersection. Red light. This is not capital expenditures like re-engineering or redesigning an intersection or any signals, that kind of things. It's never be lost one from operating.
Hey, Robert, I'm so
Yes.
sorry. This is Andrea. You're kind of breaking up a little bit. We heard you very clearly for all the other slides except for this one. So I'm not sure if something changed in the audio on your end or if there's any adjustments that you can make, but it was really only for this slide that you started to break up.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening again. It's just very slow coming in and out. Is this any better?
It is. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, 310,000 in revenue, annual revenue. Again, about 2,500 annual violations with just an estimate per intersection, and the $124 fine is what the city has in order right now for red light violations. I said about $310,000 in revenue, and maybe about 20% taking out of that money for administrative fees, but again, there'd be a charge to pass on for those fees. So I'd say 310 in revenue, and then maybe 20%. And again, just like I said, there could be some capital expenditures for the intersections to place cameras. That would just be one time, and I did not factor that into the annual operating revenue. Hope you can hear me with that. And that's all I have on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Robert. Really appreciate you pulling that information together and presenting all the way from a different continent. Thank you for that. I hope that you can please stay on because there may be a few more questions that come your way through the course of the discussion. And so given, we wanted to follow up on that information that you had requested from last time. Given that, our next pivot, and if you could get the next slide up, Jean, please. Is revisiting this question that we spent really the last 15 minutes of our last meeting way back in December discussing, which was which revenue tools should the city explore? And the last 15 minutes, we had a very substantive discussion where we heard from task force members that red light cameras were something that you wanted the city to explore further. The Transportation Benefit District sales tax option was also something you wanted to, the city to consider, and also explore Parks District. And so that's what you have brainstormed so far. The discussion for us tonight is, are there any other considerations for those three things that you want to make sure that we discuss tonight? And then do you have any other tools that we have not yet discussed that you want to make sure that we do discuss this evening? And I see that there's some questions and comments.
Let's go ahead and start with Zach, and I'm going to push myself to the back. So after Zach, go ahead, Brad.
All right, thank you. This is Zach. Quick question. Is there a difference when it comes to revenue tools between red light cameras and school zone cameras? Because I thought that's what we were talking about in our last discussion. So if someone could expand on that difference, that would be great.
So the city has one camera that's in a school zone. Those school zone cameras are, I think, governed by a different set of state regulations than red light cameras at other intersections. So that would be one difference. I'm not sure if there's also differences in terms of the violation level, the ticket value that the Issaquah Municipal Code would consider. These things we'd have to explore further. Robert just provided a really quick estimate to have an idea of how much revenue that such a thing could bring in. We did not dive any deeper to look at which intersections and try to make it that detailed. That would require a lot more of a public discussion and a lot more of a process around that. So I think we just were trying to provide some high level estimates, and I would look to the task force for your recommendations if we're only talking about school zones, or if you wanted the city to look at other busy intersections around town.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Brad.
I guess my question relates to the Parks District, and I guess I want to just get some clarification. So the maximum, as I see it, is 75 cents per thousand, and the levy lid capacity available is $2.52 per thousand. So am I reading that properly to the point where there is plenty capacity to use as much of this park district as we would need? I mean, we wouldn't need even 50% of that, but I guess I want to make sure that there's going to be, that's come up in our ad hoc committee, is what the actual capacity is for a park district.
I believe that's correct. Robert, can you confirm you want to chime in?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. That is correct. Unless the district was created specifically to bond, then it doesn't fall under that threshold. You could go above that. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy, go ahead, and then Jamie after Kathy.
Thank you. I'm going to try to cover a lot of territory here in a short amount of time. One, I know we haven't gotten to it yet, but I really appreciated having the new revenue matrix, Andrea, that you sent out. It shows, to Brad's point, that some of the taxation opportunities that we're looking at would overfund current needs, and not that needs don't change, but the last thing I think we want to do is to be too overly zealous or greedy in any proposal we move forward with. In this slide here, it's great to have the red light cameras, and I just want to say I think they're a good idea just from safety standard. I don't know that we have to, I don't know if this is the time or the place to really say what those funds are used for, considering we don't have locations yet. But I go through the intersection of Front and Sunset multiple times a day, and I just think there should be one right there. Just 2 cents for what that's worth. Car tab fees are something we really didn't discuss last time. I appreciate those being in the slide here. There is revenue there that could be considered. Same thing with the mitigation fees, although those are small. Something else we haven't talked about, and I know is particularly accessible with grants, with parks. And so we haven't talked about grants, and the reason I bring that up is because we have this ARPA bucket. We also have a lot of federal tax from the pandemic that's coming down the turnpike. And again, not to be overzealous, but I think that there needs to be a certain amount of understanding and time to discuss what usually comes in an average year. For instance, the slide about transportation, what came out of general funds, for transportation. It would have been ideal to know also how successful Issaquah was during those same years with acquiring grants, because I know we have an awesome city staff that writes amazing grants, and we do very, very well in that area. So would like to have some more information around grants. And then the only other thing is with the parks, I liked, Andrea, that you brought up all of our goals and things that were important. I know we have to get to identifying the buckets again. But parks was something that we noticed was high satisfaction, low priority. So I want to, when we're talking about adding a park district, I'm not sure that now is the time for that. Just again, my 2 cents, but I think considering it is a low priority in a high satisfactory area, I'm not really feeling that we have to go as heavy into permanent funding by creating a district. And then also, I know just in saying all that priorities will change, and that the CIP, what's on the list today, and the dollar values that are attached to it will change tomorrow. And so I do want to acknowledge that I know that as well, and we're not tasked with anything easy. So that's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Jamie, before I go, I want to interrupt. I want to say, Kathy, I want to say that I appreciate the fact that you're moving us from just questions to actually stating opinions and telling us what you think. And I think we want to spend as much time as possible doing that. I want to clarify, though, one thing you mentioned. I was a little confused about whether you were recommending car tab fees is one of your favorites or your top.
I don't know that a park district needs to be formed right now, would be my general opinion.
I got that. That was clear, and I happen to agree with you, but that's beside the point. But I actually wasn't clear on whether you were recommending car tabs. I wasn't sure your position on car tabs. I couldn't track.
Oh, okay. And I don't have an objection to car tabs. Car tabs would have applied to transportation, I take it. I guess more to the point, maybe I should surmise in that I don't think there's a one answer for all three buckets. And I think we need to look at each bucket individually as far as how we're going to fund them. I don't know that the solution is just to come back and let's say, okay, we're going to recommend increasing sales tax and creating a transportation district and a park district and these sales taxes to go along with each of them just to make it easy. Based on the matrix that Andrea provided, I think there's a lot more options after looking at that matrix.
Okay, thank you. And then I think Andrea was going to maybe address the grants question, maybe briefly, Andrea, and then we'll go to Jamie.
Thank you. You know, the grants question, and maybe you're looking for more specific information, and if you are, let me know so we can follow up on that. When we looked at our unfunded projects and how much we have in terms of unfunded, within the time horizon of the current capital improvement project, or plan rather, that was really taking into consideration our best guess for which grants we're going to be successful in. So as you look at the capital improvement plan from now into 2027, that was taking into account grants that we were pretty confident in. Beyond that 2027 timeline, it's too far into the future for us to take into consideration, oh, we think we're going to be successful for this grant 10 years from now. That's a bit presumptuous for us. But certainly that is something that we did provide our best estimates when we looked at the 2022 to 2027 projects.
Quick comment back to Andrea. Thank you, because again, I know city staff does an amazing job going after grants. And so kudos again to you. And since that's already in that consideration, it doesn't need to be taken any further.
Okay, that's really helpful. Jamie.
Yeah, I had a question around the distinction, if there is any, between a levy lid lift and the other property tax, like an EMS levy, Metropolitan Parks District. Is, like, for example, the Metropolitan Parks District just a levy lid lift that happens to be for parks and has kind of constraints related to parks? Is that the right way to look at it, or are there differences that I should be considering in how those would come to pass, or the strings attached going forward with those different options?
This is Robert. I can try to answer. Hey, Gene, can you scroll back to the breakdown of the levies? And I'll try to do this really fast because it does get technical. There's a local government maximum of $5.90 per assessed value. And all of those, if it's a general operations and maintenance levy, whether it's for a park district, library, flood control, it's going to, with some exceptions, EMS even, library flood control levy, that's going to go to that 590 maximum. If you're looking at EMS, that's not subject to the maximum. Public safety, though, say you did a public safety levy, that would go to the maximum. So again, there's some intricacies with the state law. There's some that apply to that maximum, some that do not. Now, there is a complete maximum of $10 constitutionally. You see that there's some exemptions to that, like the bond levies, for example, in the Port District. So again, those are the constraints we're operating under. But the parks levy, the way to look at that, if it's an operations and maintenance levy, that's going to be the same as a city increasing the general levy. That would go towards that $2.52 maximum. I hope that makes sense. If that's
and given that we're so far away from that lid, it would seem like there's not a ton of distinction, or unless we think we're really going to get closer to that distinction is probably not as meaningful for this conversation right now, whether it applies to that 5, whatever. Would you agree with that statement?
Right, unless you were looking at that total capacity, no, that would not hit the maximum unless you're looking at taking that whole amount.
Okay, thank you.
But as you said, Jamie, there are different strings attached to some of these different tools.
I think, Tim, that you're next.
Thank you. A couple just quick clarifying questions. My first was for these, if we choose a mix of options, does it appear to a voter as multiple things they have to vote for, or is it possible to combine things into a single vote measure? And I asked that from the perspective of people looking and saying kind of yes to the first thing and no to everything else, or looking and comparing and picking and choosing when we would present it as sort of a holistic option. How does that appear on a ballot when if you were to mix and match some of these funding options?
Can
This
you
is Robert.
give-
I can try.
Oh,
Sorry, go
okay.
ahead.
I was just going to ask Tim if you can give examples of which funding options you're talking about, because that might help us provide a better answer.
Yeah, so the two that stand out to me are the Transportation Benefit District sales tax increase. I need to look at 0.1 or 0.2%, and then some portion of the levy lift, right? So instead of 0.5, maybe it's 0.25, right? And you do a mix of those. You have the stability and of the property tax, the sharing the burden with out-of-towners of the sales tax, not maxing out either, but presenting it as a mix. That's just kind of what I was thinking is moving forward. But if it shows up on the ballot as two different initiatives, would we be better off and more likely to succeed if we picked one or the other, right? That's kind of my thinking.
Yeah, this is Robert. I'll try to take a stab at that. It has to be separate on the ballot because, for example, the Transportation Benefit District it's the city is the district, but it's separate from the city being the property tax jurisdiction. So the way the state looks at it, those would have to be separate. The only thing you could combine would be if you decided to do, say, a $20 car tab plus 0.1% of the 0.2%, because it's just impacting the Transportation Benefit District of the city. This is what we did when I was in Snoqualmie. You know, we dropped the rate of the car tabs. We eliminated the $20 TBD, the $20 car tab fee, but we did the sales tax at the 0.2% for the TBD. We did that on the same ballot initiative. So if it's the same type of tax, you can, but if it's different, again, it has to go as a separate initiative.
And then
And each initiative has different rules as far as what the majority is, even when it's on the ballot, and the timing of it, when it's appropriate, when it's not. So there's a lot of intricacies, but it does have to be separate, most of them.
Okay, thank you. And then real quick, 50 plus 1% to pass these. I remember we went out to bond before, and I'm not sure on the distinction between 60% or 50% plus one in order to enact these measures that have to go before the voters. All the ones you've talked about this evening, it looked like 50 per plus one would get them passed based on that chart.
That's correct. For the general operations and maintenance ones, that's 50 plus one.
So everything
if there's
we
any
talked about
bonding,
tonight.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I think I'm next. I guess I kind of have a comment. I appreciate all the questions, but I also am anxious to hear more about what people think. And so I'm going to say what I think. And I think red light cameras on principle are a good idea. I think the TBD sales tax is a good idea. And although, Robert, you did address some of the concerns to residents, I think that there may be some pushback from the businesses just on how it might affect their business. So I think that's a consideration. Nonetheless, I still think the TBD sales tax is a good idea. I think it doesn't, the equity regarding the fact that it's regressive is to me more than offset by the geographic sort of fairness question that, so there's a geographic equity, which we don't normally talk about as much when we talk about equity, but that's a big issue. I'm less inclined to lean towards the Parks District only because we talked about transportation being the priority. And so the Parks District would address, being the first one we want to tackle. Everything's important. And I wanted to know, I don't know enough about a lot of these tools to just say that I think it's a good idea. But the question is, what revenue tools should the city explore more? And I guess I'm wondering what some more the downside of the levy lid lift, because the levy lid lift seems to me to be consistent with what we're trying to accomplish, because it can be used for transportation. And the thing about the parks is it's still coming out of the same wallet. There's different, I know a fair amount about special purpose districts and some of the ways they are used, and they really, at the end of the day, it's a different mechanism, but it is still coming out of people's, when they write their property tax check. So I guess those are my comments and my opinions. And I guess I want to flip it to a question, and I'm curious why the levy lid lift has not bubbled higher up. And I guess I'd be interested in other committee members, maybe who have opinions about that, why that was not bubbling up in the last meeting. And maybe, let's see, it looks like Susan and Councilman Marks and Stacy, but maybe if it's okay, could we just see if anybody has any strong opinions about levy lid lift and why that wasn't? So I'm really putting the question not to staff, but rather to the rest of the committee, if it's okay, but take a couple seconds and see if anyone has a comment about that. Susan, Tola, or Stacy, are your comments completely separate, or are you responding to what I'm saying?
Separate. So
Separate.
Separate.
I mean, I had one quick thought on the levy lid lift. It stands out to me is it's the biggest number, right, in terms of making an impact. And there's less restrictions so that it could go towards different purposes. And so that, to me, is that category. If you think big and you have some aspirations, then that's the one to consider. My personal mindset is maybe not max out any of these, especially when it comes to the sales tax. And if you do a 0.1% sales tax increase versus 0.2, that might be better received by our business community. And to make up the difference, maybe it's a mix of funding sources.
I'm going to take chair privilege and go to Jamie because he's responding to my question. Thanks. Go ahead, Jamie.
I guess for me, part of it is it seems almost border like semantics, because to like a levy lid lift, we're presumably going to need to, like the city would need to market that to voters. So you're gonna have to say it's for something, and then it's probably for one of these things that we're talking about. So I guess that's part of the reason, like it doesn't seem targeted, and I think I would be interested in how other cities have used that, because I'm just struggling to see how that how you would market that as a general. We're just gonna like a general levy lid lift without some kind of this is what it's going for, and have voters be okay with that. So that's my biggest question is, if that's been done in the past in other cities, how did they market it? What was kind of the focus? And yeah, when they went to the voters, how was that positioned with them?
Let's go to Kathy.
I know that when we talked about the sales tax, one of the things that came up, and I know Tola was one that mentioned it as well as many others at the last meeting, was the fairness in having a sales tax, because it's everyone that's shopping here, not just residents. But with the levy lid lift, I like that for parks more because, again, most of our parks, as we discussed, are used by our residents. So we talked about local parks being for our residents and what we want out of it. And so maybe it was just a matter of, we were generalizing last time, and now we're getting down into the nitty gritty. And this gets back to my comment earlier about, I think there's different types of taxes, not just as city staff has mentioned, what is allowable by law and what isn't, but how each of our needs within these buckets are used and who's using them. So personally, I like the idea of a levy lid lift, and that is hard to say, being something that more something that parks could use, because again, it's mostly residents that we're using our parks.
Okay, thanks for indulging me. Let's go back to the order that people were commenting. Susan had a comment.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this actually ties in maybe a little bit to the levy lid lift discussion. I really was trying to think very hard about the buckets, the transportation versus the parks and trails versus the facilities. And the sort of the idea that made sense to me out of all these discussions is, overall, I think we want to strive to maintain what we already have in good working order, to prevent bad things from happening. And then we also have an opportunity for potentially some opportunistic growth or opportunistic improvement. And even when I look at the transportation bucket, to me, it sort of naturally falls into those two pieces. And I'm really skirting that edge of not looking at what's inside the bucket, but I feel like what's in the transportation bucket is going to be some maintenance stuff. And then it's also going to be some opportunistic, big ticket, improving life types of items. So the way that I was looking at the funding sources is I was thinking, okay, could we, within the transportation bucket, say for just care and maintenance, use a 0.1 of the transportation benefit district sales tax. And then I also included a $20, not a $40 license fee. I'm rethinking that a little bit because of Tim's question a few minutes ago about how this could be presented to the voters and whether we would want to have two parts or one part. But if those two components plus potentially some component of the property tax or the levy lid lift could go toward maintenance, I think voters could understand that, get behind that, just recognize that that's sort of like the cost of maintaining this wonderful place that we live in. Separately from that, I feel like we could serve up some of the bigger visionary sort of like, we're going to rip the Band-Aid off. We're really going to try to make some big improvements in the transportation. We've heard your pain, and serve up a larger opportunistic project within transportation, but ask for voters to put some skin in the game. So say, listen, this is going to be really expensive. It's something that y'all are screaming for. We all want it, but it's pricey, and we're either going to go in together or we're not going to do it. Because if we can sort of separate those two pieces of transportation, if voters feel like they're just not in the mood this time, because of what's going on in their lives, what's going on in the country, they just cannot stomach a large improvement project for transportation, at least we don't lose our maintenance funds that sort of keep us, keep everything, a pleasant place to live. Because I was really struck by the experience last time with how the voters responded to the bond, and it feels to me a little bit too risky to go all or nothing in regard to transportation. So I'm just wondering if there might be an approach to kind of break up those two pieces. That's the part that I think I put the most thought into. For parks and trails, I really did like the park district approach because of the fact that it does capture folks who use our parks who don't live here, which I was under the impression that there was quite a bit of usage from people who live in nearby communities who come in and use our parks. Perhaps that's anecdotal. I don't know that that's borne out by the data, but if we did that, we could expand and match up, again, users and then people who and the revenue that comes in to maintain our parks. And I was thinking not the full 0.75, but something like a 0.35 or something that I remember the comment made during that presentation that 0.75 was kind of a big gulp for the Parks District. So perhaps we would do something less than that. And then for facilities, we haven't spent a lot of time on facilities, but I was kind of attracted by the public safety sales tax. And I know that was an example that was talked about a few minutes ago from one of the other cities that perhaps if we do need, again, some, care and maintenance of our facilities, that voters could more easily understand that coming from a public safety sales tax and kind of administration of our infrastructure. But that one, admittedly, spent a little bit less time on. So thank you.
That's really great. Thanks. Jamie.
I think Councilmember Marks.
Thanks. And
Thank
then Stacy, I think.
Sorry.
So first a question. Somebody mentioned earlier, we're not considering bonds in this conversation. Can I ask why not?
Bonds bonds are absolutely on the table. It's one of the questions that we want to answer. Even if you were to suggest bonds, we still need revenue tools to pay for those bonds. So that would be, I think, really the next one of the next questions that we need to answer. If you have revenue tools that you would recommend, then the next question is, do we bond or do we pay as we go, right? So that's on the table. But first, we need to figure out a way to pay for such bonds.
But they're different revenue mechanisms, right? And that's why they have different. So you said if we want to consider bonds, we have to consider a revenue mechanism, but they are different than the ones we're considering here, right? Which is why they have a different threshold for passage, right?
Yeah. So a voter-approved bond does have a different threshold.
Right.
That's correct.
As we found out, right? Because we went for a bond. I mean, this gets to this whole question about going big, which several people have said in different forums in the last few minutes, which is, you know, explaining to the public what you want to do, and does it move the needle? Does it move the needle for transportation? Does it move the needle for recreation? Does it move the needle for services? You know, if people feel it moves the needle, they'll spend money on it and they'll vote to spend money on it. And if they think it's junk, or if they think it's things the city should be paying for out of existing revenues, they won't vote for it. So that's one of the considerations when you look at bonds. Because you're making a longer term commitment, you have more money up front, you can move the needle more, but you're also making a longer term commitment, which is why you have to, why it has to pass by 60% instead of 50%, because that's just an ongoing revenue. Comments on some of these things. The red light cameras, you know, one of the things to think about is it's kind of in a sneaky way, a way to do congestion district, which is something the city has sort of toyed around with, or at least had conversations in background in the past, which is like how London does it, right? Where you just have a fee to come into a city. The problem is you can't levy that on people outside. You have to levy it on everybody. But that's effectively what you do, and you're just catching the people who don't get into the intersection before the light turns red. So it's an interesting thing. It might have a side benefit of lowering some of the through traffic that we get in the city from people outside. If they thought that they had a risk of getting a ticket, maybe they would take Highway 18 out to exit 25 instead of coming into Issaquah. I do want to mention that some folks really, really, really hate the speed camera. And we do get upon occasion letters, and they are burningly caustic. And I'll tell you that, you know, Mayor Freisinger would be as caustic back to them as they were to her, because she viewed it as a public safety for our kids. And she was basically like, well, I guess you're against safety for our kids. So we just have to understand that that is a needle that could generate some revenue and have some interesting side benefits, but would make those of us who are elected officials, it would make our lives more difficult, because we would get lots of nasty letters from the community. Sales tax, you know, it is trading income inequity with regional equity. You know, we only have a few levers that allow us to get to this regional impact. And by the way, whether it's our shops or our parks, you know, a way to think about the patch of people who use our city is it can be thought of as roughly generally the same size as the school district. You know, we got a chunk of Sammamish to the north, we got a chunk of Bellevue to the west, we have a chunk of unincorporated King County to the east and the south. And so our patch of people is about 40,000, but there's another 50 or 60,000 who view Issaquah as their primary location for parks and businesses and services and whatnot. And so, you know, there's only a few levers that allow us to get at those folks. And sales taxes is one of those levers, as much as I dislike it from a sales progressive or tax progressiveness standpoint, which is why I hate tabs, or I should say a flat tabs fee. I don't mind progressive tabs. If you have an expensive car, fine, but everybody paying the same thing for car tabs is a terrible idea. So that back to the regional use parks district, you know, the city looked, I think I mentioned in comments on an earlier one of our meetings. We looked at a parks district that was, we did surveying at a city level and a regional level. And although regional people would use our parks, there was less appetite regionally. Although it would be a bigger amount of money you could generate, there was less interest. It would be informative to call that data up. That data is maybe, I want to say 6 or 7 years old, but we did do it as a city. Levy lid lift, I'm hugely in support of. I think that's a great idea. That's totally progressive. It taxes the people most who can most afford to go for it, and least on the folks who have the hardest time getting by in our city. So I just want to close again with this idea of go big. Like that will make or break whatever we ask of the public. If we come up with a coherent plan that addresses things that matter to them, particularly transportation and traffic, then they'll respond well to it. And if it seems like a rat's nest of mishmash projects, they won't. Thanks.
That's great. Stacy, I think you're next.
Yeah, thanks. So I will kind of start where Tola left off just to begin with, and that's I agree with his comment about if voters understand what you want to achieve and they agree with what you want to achieve, and they agree with lots of other things, are not feeling particularly grumpy, then they're going to support what you want to do. I feel pretty strongly that the red light cameras are something that should be considered immediately. I think it's an immediate source of revenue that is paid by, I can call them bad actors or just unfortunate people who decided to try to sneak into an intersection or speed through a school zone. It's a little bit difficult to feel bad for people who are getting tickets for doing things that are unsafe. And in all the nearly 11 years I was on council, I'm not sure I can and I was here when we put the one in on second. I can't recall any nasty emails that we've gotten. Not saying we haven't gotten any, but it's a little bit disingenuous to be angry about something if you're doing something against the law and you just happen to be caught by a camera. So I could really not care less about people complaining about that. I think where that gets us is potentially quite a bit of money for each camera that we put in, that we could, within the first year, start putting it towards some projects to make a difference. And during that time, then come up with a plan of what to do with that money, and start attacking some of the transportation projects that we have. And it doesn't take very long to accumulate a lot of money. I think the other thing I'm not sure that I have super strong feelings about the revenue sources. I think it just sort of, all of them depend on what's going on at the time in the world. Levy lifts, I think it's easy to kind of get caught up in the negative press that the McCleary decision over the last few years and what some of the districts have done, and how the perception of some districts who have maybe mishandled that or used it. And there's also potentially going to be coming up here in the next little while, requests from our district for increased cost to the new proposed high school. So that would be my concern. I think people might just have some fatigue. But I really think the key is planning and listening to the voters and trying to be in touch with them. We did receive a fairly long and extremely thoughtful email from one of our constituents, Steve Pereira, who does pay attention to the council a lot. And I thought he had some extremely good points. One of his points was that a bond or a levy for large road projects, nothing seems to be transformative enough at this point for him to warrant approval for that. And he kind of bases his opinion on, even if we improve and widen Highway 18 all the way, that people will still choose to bypass through Issaquah. And I'm assuming that what he means then is, by doing a big project that widens the road, we're just going to we're still doing something that is allowing people to pass through Issaquah. And so I'm not saying that I agree or don't agree with his comment, but that's really not the point. The point is that we need to listen to people who are going to be the voters. He also mentioned that this task force didn't discuss whether we should consider not doing existing things, that we just kind of opted rather quickly to consider asking voters for more money. I don't know if I remember that conversation well enough, but that seemed to have resonated with him as something that, well, didn't resonate well with him. So I think in short that we should pay attention very closely to the very few people who actually are paying attention to what we're doing. And if you all haven't read that email from him, that we thought, I would recommend that. And then I would like to see the other point that he made that I thought was interesting. And again, doesn't mean I agree or disagree. Doesn't matter. His perception, his opinion is a voter, and his perception and opinion is important if he's a voter. And that is that it seems that we get to budget time every year. And when I say we, I mean sort of the city, the council as a whole, and we don't really have these are my words, like a plan that we stick to. We just kind of pick things from here and there. And so I think the voters would appreciate, just based on what he's saying, voters would appreciate more of a long-term plan that we stuck to and didn't change every couple of years. And thinking it back around to the beginning, I just feel strongly that the traffic cameras are somewhere to start. Doesn't cost our voters anything, and it's all paid for by the folks who do bad things, and it creates a lot of money, and we can do some good things with those monies, and we can come up with a plan. And I think the voters would approve a grand plan from us, but I don't think we should start with that. Those are my comments.
Thank you. This is a great discussion. I want to check with Andrea to make sure. I know I of concern that the 5 questions, we weren't going to be taking them in order. We're kind of taking them together. This is obviously a super important, I mean, everyone has a lot to say, and this is great that we're getting to that. Andrea, are you comfortable with the way we're using our time in relation to the questions?
Yes, this is a fantastic discussion, and thank you so much. The next question that I'd like for us to go to
is... I'm sorry, Andrea, there were still people that had comments, so I was going to give them a chance, but I just wanted to take a moment and just see, did you want us to try to take them in turn?
Right, so the next question that I wanted us to go to is timing. We're not ready to do that yet, but that is a question that's coming up. And so as much as we can kind of throw out on the table all the tools that we should be considering and the pros and cons and your considerations for those tools, that's great. So I think this discussion has been really good. Thank you. And we can turn to timing once we're kind of done with this part of the discussion.
Okay, we got a comment from Mayor Pauly saying fabulous discussion. So we'll press on. I just want to make sure that we're getting everything that we can. Okay, so Jamie had a comment, and sorry, I went out of order because we bounced to say, and I think Brad is after that. And I do want to circle back to Susan and ask for a clarify, but go ahead, Jamie, then Brad.
Thanks, Cynthia. I would echo very much what Stacy was saying on red light cameras. I don't want to go through all the different reasons, but that seems like a tool that we should be using, and in terms of timing, something that we should be doing soon, and especially because it doesn't need voter approval. That seems to me a no-brainer, as it also would be something that we could support our #1 priority of transportation within the city. Next after that, and these are, that in my mind is the no-brainer. I think the transportation benefit district sales tax, to me, for a lot of the reasons that Councilmember Martz was mentioning, is a really interesting tool. I think ultimately what I'd be interested in is not this group, but someone to be going out and saying, these are the projects that we would include that would be a part, like how would we go out and market, like what is the group of projects that would be a part of that, kind of almost bottoms up to like define, do we think we have something here that people would support and that people could rally around. I think similarly, the other thing that's interesting to me is the Metropolitan Parks District. And I put it in a similar category of, can we put together a compelling group of projects that we think people will really, and not we, but generally the general we put together a group of projects that we think people will support and that they're going to see value in. I think that'll define how much I think we need to go out for, whether we need to bond and a lot of the other things. But in my mind, those are the revenue tools that seem most compelling. A lot of the other ones, like tabs, I'm not very interested in because they're the most regressive, don't have a lot of dollars associated with them. And I think in terms of our priorities, I think the tools that I mentioned hit on, and I know there's the facilities piece as well. But in terms of what I'm most interested in, the three that I mentioned in that order and timing and process are what I would recommend.
Sorry, Brad, before you go, I just realized I'm looking at, I did have the comment I wanted to make was that, and thank you, Jamie, but was that Parker, who was not in attendance tonight, did want to weigh in, and he had the same top two, but he was, sorry, he was really interested in the EMS, the EMS levy. And so that hasn't been discussed a lot. I just want to get that on the record that Parker was really interested in that. And his other two were the ones that we've been talking about. I just want to get that out and go to Brad. Thanks.
I'll try and be brief. Couple things. As far as red light, I'm not a big advocate of Big Brother, but I do see a need for safety. And I think that focus really needs to be about safety on that one rather than revenue, because I think the public would really push back to use that type of effort for revenue as being a focus. If they looked at it as being safety as the focus, I think they would support it. You know, I was really disappointed in our last meeting to actually see about the growth pace for growth. And I think we need to explore that a little further to get community support for any additional items. And I guess one of the things that I thought that was missing a little bit is that with increased population also comes an increased tax base. And so it's not just the 1 to 5% in impact fees that pays for growth, it's the greater population and that greater tax base that actually also pays for growth in infrastructure. I know we probably don't have an accounting of that, but that's still something to be aware of, that there is more being paid for growth through that increased population rather than through impact fees. In terms of transportation, I think the big issue here is it's going to be hard for the community to support an increase in taxes unless they actually see improvement in mobility. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, with what we've talked about is actually going to really solve a lot in terms of mobility, because there are regional mobility problems, and everybody's very well aware of that. But as I see it, any TBD that we do is really just kind of working around the edges. And I'm not so sure that the community is going to be supportive of increasing in taxes if we're really not going to solve mobility problems. So I mean, that's a huge issue that really needs to be discussed a lot further than just this task force before we would implement something like that. The Parks District, to me, is a very good concept, because I think we need to look long-term rather than short-term, and that provides an opportunity for some long-term park development. You know, if we were only looking at the 6-year CIP, we're short of $20 million or something, we'd be better off just going with a bond to try and solve that. But we've got over $100 million worth of future unfunded items in parks, and so that's where the Parks District makes the most sense. I know that it appears to be a high satisfied, low priority, but to me, that's not where we would want to focus on parks. We need to look more long term, and the Parks District potentially could get us there. more to share, but I'll cut it off for that. Thanks.
So Susan, before you ask your question, Andrea wanted to clarify something. I'll let Andrea ask her question.
Thanks. And I, again, really appreciate the discussion. A couple of you have been very rapid fire with your thoughts, and I've been trying to frantically take notes and capture everything. So one of the things that I wanted to clarify with Susan is I heard you say Parks District was something you were interested in because regional users would help pay for the parks that they use. And so I just wanted to clarify something. Parks District, the revenue tool there is really a property tax. So the property tax would be tied to the boundaries of the Parks District. In order to make regional users help pay for the parks, we would have to draw those boundaries larger than the city boundaries. And I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that, and if that's really your recommendation, that that if the city does consider forming a parks district, that parks district is more regional and goes beyond the city boundaries.
Yes, that was my understanding, and that's why I recognized that it was new and a bit risky, but I thought it was worth exploring. So yeah, that's what I was suggesting that we think about.
Great. I wanted to make sure that I heard you correctly. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just had a quick question. I am compelled by the conversation around red light cameras or traffic cameras. I think they're a good idea. I would be in support of those. My question is, how many are we talking about? Because I see from the slide that was presented that a high volume single light could produce as much as 310,000 a year. Is that correct? Are we talking 2? Are we talking 10? I mean, what is has city or staff given any thought to like what our capacity would be for a reasonable number of these?
This would have to be something that we would explore in greater detail. Issaquah isn't that large of a city, 10 intersections. I don't know that we could do. In your packet, we had made a very rough assumption of 3 intersections.
Okay.
And so, but that would be something that we would have to have more public discussion, more weigh in on different community groups and city council. So, and that's a little bit outside of the scope of this group. I think a level of recommendation from you, if you were to say, yes, we want you to look into red light cameras, we think that this is a valuable tool, and we want you to do that in immediate term, that's really the level of recommendations we're looking at from this task force. But I see Mayor Polly has turned on her camera, and so I certainly yield if she has different direction.
No, Andrea, you're actually right. Hi, everybody. Happy 2022. I just thought I would relay some additional information from conversations I've had with our interim police chief. Since the original council decision to make a nexus between the revenues over costs on a speed camera to safety projects, I hold that value very, very close to my heart. I do not believe it's about making revenue. I believe it does make revenue, but it is about safety, 100% first and foremost. My conversations with our interim chief is that our police officers know, just as you know, that there are certain turns that are dangerous. There are certain places. It's not all left turns at an intersection, but there might be a particular left turn, one movement only at a light that is the constant source of people running the red light, blocking the intersection, and having congestion impacts. So our approach from a public safety point of view will be to start the conversation about where we can see safety improvements. And that's where we'll start from. What you will see out of that, the council would see, is a financial evaluation of the cost to install the cameras, the benefits that we would see hopefully in the improved safety, and whether or not there were revenues over costs. And my recommendation to the council, which would be their purview to approve or not, would be to decide how to allocate those revenues, with the mayor strongly suggesting that they go back into safety. So that's where it would be. There's a lot of work to be done. But our police department did do a study 4 years ago. Council reviewed it. I don't believe it had enough information in it. And it's my hope to bring that back again if that is something, even from a safe, I may bring that back just from the safety point of view, regardless of whether or not this group recommended that revenue could be used for safety. So just wanted to add that in, and thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mayor Polly. I think if I'm tracking right, Tim Flood is next.
Thank you. I'll try to be succinct. So forgive me if I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but I want to just get this on the record at some point during this conversation. And as we're having the red light camera, it just is front of mind for me. As I was doing some research, I came across an intelligent signal management platform. I got a quick demonstration and cost estimate, and I think it's something that it's not on the SIP, but would be a fantastic thing for the city, maybe not this committee, to evaluate. It would address congestion without any physical roadway construction, align with our intermodal priorities, reduce emissions, aid police, emergency vehicles, school buses, be a solution in the think big category, and be a sensational return on investment. So basically leverages AI. There's 55 intersections in the city, an upfront cost of about 1.65 million, and after 5 years, ongoing cost of 110,000. That's something that we could pay for with a couple of red light cameras that could have a tremendous bang for your buck. So for nothing else, something that we should evaluate, potentially add to the SIP as a city to leverage technology, improve that traffic flow with the technology that exists without having any, shovel-ready projects to get there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I was just gonna, I think I have the next comment, then I'm gonna turn it back over to Andrea. Maybe she can advance to the next question. I just wanted to say that, Brad, when you mentioned that we couldn't move the needle on mobility, I've made that comment a few times that we can't really move the needle necessarily on vehicular congestion. I just wanted to make a distinction there. I think we can build a fantastically equitable mobile transportation system with the things that are in the CIP. I've always been concerned that we aren't ever really going to be able to reduce vehicular congestion, but mobility is another matter, and I think we can move the needle and do big things. So I just wanted to weigh in there because I think it's an extremely important distinction. That's all I had to say on that. Andrea?
Great. Thank you again so much for that discussion. What I heard you say collectively is that there seems to be overall interest from the task force regarding red light cameras, the TBD sales tax, the levy lid lift, and the parks district. That's what I heard most frequently come up from you. Another thing that was put forward is the vehicle license fee as well. And so given those revenue tools that you've been discussing, I'd like to turn to when should the city consider employing these tools? And so we've been talking about the context of the priorities in terms of, first, second, third. So some of these tools, we may, and I've heard this a number of times this evening, red light cameras. Maybe that's something that's in the more immediate term. That's what I heard from many of you. I also heard concerns that for TBD sales tax or something related to the Transportation Benefit District, we want to go big or go home. Maybe we're not quite ready to do that. Maybe that's not an immediate term. Maybe that's something that's more longer term while we determine what is that project or that suite of projects that makes a really big impact. And so these are some of the considerations for what is the timing that you want the city to consider for each of these tools. So we have a poll that we've formed based off of this discussion, and I will turn it over to Jean to lead us through that poll.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think Juliana actually just launched the first poll. So quick introduction. Obviously, Andrea just gave you the list of revenue tools. We're going to ask you to basically consider when you would want to use that tool, if you want to use that tool. So we have kind of 4 options in terms of time frame: the short term, 0 to 3 years, medium term, 4 to 6 years, long term, 6 to 9, something beyond a 10-year horizon. And then the last option that you can choose is simply that you do not recommend to use that tool. So the idea here is we're trying to identify consensus not only around using a tool, but when that tool might be kind of best used, and then kind of the interaction of when all those kind of timeframes might happen. So, you know, if everybody's in favor of every tool, but they're all short term, that will obviously lead to more discussion. But if there's some spread out, it might be kind of informative to see that. So our hope this evening is to kind of get all that input. Depending on time, we might be able to kind of do some live analysis. We might also move on. I'll just turn it over to Andrea at that point to see if we're trying to advance the discussion to some of the other questions, or if we'll just kind of use the remaining time for some analysis and discussion of this. But the first question is up. I've already used 1 minute and 20 seconds of your time to respond. And I think there was one other question before we kick off the poll. Was there a question?
Thanks, Gene. Yeah, I'll just hop in. Sorry, Cynthia. I know it's hard to see the chat right now. I was wondering, so when we're talking about these time periods, is this to beginning of evaluating the tool? Is this when we think that ultimately, like, the dollars would start flowing with this tool? What is, like, when we're thinking about time frame, what is our definition of time frame here?
Dollars would start flowing.
Okay, so if there aren't any other questions about kind of process, like I said, we'll try and go through the about 5 different tools that Andrea listed. So beginning with the red light cameras, please feel free to respond.
And Jean, how will we have a sense whether everybody's responded? Are we just waiting for the clock to tick out?
Juliana is actually hosting the poll, so I think when
great.
she sees 10 responses, she can close out the poll.
Great, thanks.
And it looks like, in fact, she did close out the poll.
You'll have to give me a little bit of feedback. Can you see these responses, everybody? Okay, great. So we have 10 votes in support of a short-term basis for the red light camera.
Actually, I'm sorry, Juliana. I nodded when I shouldn't have nodded. We actually can't see the tally. Can you repeat that?
I see 10 votes in support of a short-term basis for the red light camera. So I will save these results and then move on to the next poll. Jean, do you have a particular order?
I think TBD sales tax was just next on the slide. So if that's available, you could pull that one up next, please.
I think
Kathy, did you have a question?
Sorry. It's hard. My chat is teeny tiny, so it's just go ahead and speak up.
I know, and it's not really important, but you know, when the question reads, when the city should consider deploying the tool, but Andrea, you said revenue coming in. But I know in some of these, it takes time to get it on the ballot, and then you wait a year for the taxes to be collected. So I'm a little bit confused into where my answer might fall based on that information.
Andrea, did you want to respond? I saw you nod momentarily. Otherwise, I can just try and take a crack at that.
Go for it, Jean.
I mean, obviously it is possible for some delay between a ballot measure and the receipt of those funds, but it could still conceivably happen, you know, in the first 0 to 3 years if you were thinking it needed to be a short term. Otherwise, as Andrea indicated earlier, just whenever you wanted those funds to start arriving might be the best way to respond to it.
Okay. We have 10 responses, 3 votes in favor of the short-term basis, 5 votes in favor of the medium-term basis, 0 votes in favor of long-term, 0 votes in favor of outlying years, and 2 votes do not recommend this tool at this time.
Okay, thanks, Juliana. If you could do the Parks District next, please.
You bet. Sorry, here I am reading things off and on mute. We have 1 vote in favor of the short-term basis, 5 votes in favor of medium-term basis, 2 votes in favor of long-term basis, 0 votes in favor of outlying years, and 2 votes do not recommend this tool at this time.
Okay, thanks, Juliana. Do you have a question ready for a levy lid lift, or do you need to kind of modify one real quick?
I do have one ready.
Great, thank you.
Here we go. We have 5 votes in favor of the short-term basis for the levy lid lift, 2 votes in favor of the medium-term basis, 2 votes in favor of the long-term basis, 0 votes in favor of outlying years, and 1 vote does not recommend the tool at this time.
Thanks, Juliana. And then I think the vehicle license fee was the last revenue tool on the list.
Coming right up, vehicle license fee. Okay, for the vehicle license fee, 0 votes in favor of the short-term basis, 2 votes in favor of medium-term basis, 0 votes in favor of long-term basis, 0 votes in favor of outlying years, and 8 votes do not recommend this tool at this time.
Okay, I've kind of captured all those in a spreadsheet that I can share real quick, but before we kind of stop polling, I just want to make sure I didn't miss any revenue tools. Was that the complete list? Okay, so let me share real quick just so everyone can see kind of the overall breakdown. So for 10 votes in favor of the short term for the red light cameras, the TBD sales tax, most of the votes occurring in the medium term, the same for the Parks District, 5 votes for the short term for the levy lid lift, and a majority opposed to the vehicle license fee. So looks like there's some clear consensus for a couple of those tools. And then I guess in the interest of time, we have about 5-6 minutes. Do we want to have any more comments or discussion, or just kind of pause here and kind of continue this next time? I guess I'm looking at Andrea or Cynthia for
Andrea, I was
thoughts.
just saying, Andrea, is there anything that will be particularly helpful as we wrap up?
I think if we were to open up for discussion, I just don't know that we have enough time for that. So I think we're leaving on a cliffhanger here regarding some of these other items. Would love to bring back this spreadsheet and start off our conversation next time, just discussing these results and thinking about them holistically in relationship with each other as well, and with the stated priorities of the task force.
I think it's going to be helpful. This will help inform the rest of them anyway, and we'll have some time to chew on it. So it's, well, are you suggesting that we go ahead and wrap? Does anybody have any, the chat, I guess if I get rid of the polling, the chat comes back. It was hiding in a teeny little window. I mean, I guess we have 5 minutes. No one ever complained about stopping early, but I am, okay, so Councilmember Hall has a question. And Susan has a question. So let's do lightning round and start with Councilmember Hall and go to Susan. Zach and Susan.
Thanks. Yeah, this is Zach. Just real quick for Andrea and staff, I was wondering if for our next meeting, because I want to get into ARPA too, and we didn't talk about ARPA dollars. I've been thinking ARPA would be an interesting use for design and engineering work in the infrastructure space. So I was wondering if someone for the next meeting could come back and kind of give us an estimate of how much design engineering dollars are budgeted in each bucket. So we can kind of get a sense, and then a reminder of how much ARPA funding we have, so we can kind of get a sense of where that might fit in, and if that's something we should consider. Thanks.
Susan, did you raise your hand?
I just wanted to do a quick confirmation on when our next meeting is.
That was the next thing we were going to tackle too. Thank you. That I had kind of forgotten, and Andrew reminded me. So yes, I noticed there was a poll. Andrew, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks. So we haven't heard back from everybody from the poll, but since we have you all here tonight, it seemed like the consensus for those who responded was January 26th, 5 to 7 p.m. was the most popular time. And so I was hoping that we could confirm that in this meeting. So if you could pull up your calendars, January 26th, 5 to 7 p.m. I'm getting some thumbs up, some nods. Is there anybody that has a conflict with that time? Okay, great. Seeing none, then that is when we will plan our next meeting. Thank you so much.
Cynthia again. I'll just say that I didn't respond because I tore my ACL and I'm going to have surgery, and I'm trying to do that as soon as possible. And it sounds like it's pretty brutal, so that's why I didn't respond. So we may I may drop out and have to have the chair carry us across the finish line, or I'm not exactly sure what's happening, but I'm just trying desperately to schedule surgery ASAP. So just apologize in advance if I have to miss another really inspiring discussion. This is really great. But I may be hopped up on pain meds, and so I just don't know what it's going to be. but I'll be fine. So with that, I guess it's time to wrap up. Thank you, Mayor Polly, for eavesdropping, and thank you, everybody. It's a great discussion. Everybody brings does all their homework and brings really good stuff, so that's really great. And I look forward to the next one. And anything else, Andrea? I'm forgetting anything? Okay.
No, thank you. Great discussion. Also just wanted to give a shout out to the staff who really supported this meeting today. And so thank you, Robert, from joining us from your vacation. Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you so much, Juliana. Without you guys, we couldn't have gotten as far as we did in the discussion. So just wanted to thank them for all their help with this.
Thank you. I never seem to remember to thank the staff, but you guys are awesome. Yeah, good job. Okay, well, have a great night. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.